What's going on, guys? The Belgian Grand Prix has come and gone, and do not fret because this race recap is definitely over the minimum weight limit. But we're going to talk about everything we saw this weekend, from the last few laps of excitement, the surprising pole sitter, and everything in between. And then we'll wrap things up with our predictions results. But without further ado, let's go ahead. Let's jump on into this thing. What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the channel. We're here to talk about the Belgian Grand Prix. But before we jump into our quick hits, if you haven't already, subscribe down below if you're a fan of F1 or sim racing content. We're here to talk a little bit about both on this channel. But as well, leave a comment below what you would give your rating for the Belgian Grand Prix out of 10, because I'm very interested to see how the perception of this race goes down just because of how it ended. And as always, turn on notifications so you don't miss a single upload. And if at any point during the video you enjoy it, leave me a like. It really helps me out. But let's go ahead and jump onto this thing and get this thing started with our race quick hits. Not as many quick hits this week because I think in all the grand scheme of things, I think the race actually kind of boils down to only a few very specific points. I mean, realistically, we saw a Mercedes that looked surprisingly quick. We looked at Red Bull, who surprisingly was not as quick as many of us expected. And we saw a McLaren and Ferrari that were kind of somewhere in the middle. But I think we're going to start, obviously, with Mercedes because I think you have to. Well, when they cross the line, it looks like we see a Mercedes 1-2, but ultimately, as we know, or if you haven't heard already, George Russell's car came in under the minimum weight limit by about 1.5K. And so, 1.5 kilograms. And so he ends up being disqualified from the race after finishing first in this one by turning a two-stop into a surprise one-stop, where he was able to come home, hold off Lewis Hamilton and a charging Oscar Piastri to finish first in this one. It was a shocking development, but I think it ultimately showed that overtaking this weekend was surprisingly difficult. Now, the FIA did move the DRS line for the Camel Straight back. I think I saw by about 75 meters. And I think that really did show that it really came on. It was much more about getting a good exit coming out of Eau Rouge and Raidillon than it was just about using DRS and getting past. And so I think that actually helps encourage a lot of racing. But as the track and the race wore on, and obviously tire deg at Spa is very interesting and very unique with how long of a lap it is, I think ultimately we saw a race that kind of teetered towards not as much overtaking and becoming much more, surprisingly, about track position. And that ultimately is what got George across the line in first. But unfortunately, whether it was not enough fuel, the tire, not being a little more worn than they initially anticipated, or not being able to do their cooldown lap and pick up marbles for the tire, George's car unfortunately did not meet weight minimums, and so he was ultimately disqualified, giving Lewis Hamilton the win. Lewis running very well in this one, qualified near the front, and ultimately ran in first for a good chunk of this race, and was definitely on track to win until George converted to the one stop and was able to hold on for the win himself. So Lewis inherits win number 105 and podium 201, and an incredible run of form for him over the last couple of years. And I think ultimately, he'll be pretty happy that he ended up getting the win. I think he did feel a little let down after the race was over because he was running very, very well for most of the race, but then ultimately was just basically out-strategized by his own team. And I know it was George's call, but it must not have felt good in the moment, but he will end up coming home to take the win. I'm still gutted for George. Ultimately, he ran a very damn near perfect race at this point to come home and finish first, and it just ultimately was let down by the team in not getting, above that minimum weight limit. So I don't know. What do you think? Let me know down in the comment section below. Not necessarily about this qualification, because those are definitely the ones that as soon as you're under the minimum or whatever it was, it's very cut and dry. I don't think there's a lot of room for argument. We saw Lewis actually be on the receiving end of this last year at Circuit of the Americas, a race I was at, and very excited for Lewis to be on the podium again. But ultimately, he and Charles Leclerc were disqualified from that race due to higher plank wear than what is allowed. And so, unfortunately, the DQ is pretty cut and dry, and you feel bad for him. But let me know what you think down in the comment section below. Moving on to, I think the next talking point needs to be Red Bull, and how I think they are officially firmly in the pack at the front. I think we've seen, Max hasn't won 4 of the last 5 races, I think I saw was a statistic. And we've seen 2 Mercedes wins and 2 McLaren wins in the meantime. And this weekend at Spa, a track, Red Bull recently has been extremely dominant at. All of a sudden, you see Sergio Perez fall back from a front row start to P7 with George's retirement, or from George's disqualification. And Max ends up finishing P4 after starting P11. Now, we expected Max to make his way through the field, but at the same time, it did not seem like he was making the progress many of us expected him to. And so at the end of the day, I think Red Bull are firmly in the pack, and it's gonna set up a very, very exciting finish to this season. But unfortunately, we had the summer break in between there, so it'll be very, very interesting to see what happens in the Netherlands when F1 is back. Another team, or at least another driver I want to talk about, is McLaren, specifically Oscar Piastri, coming on P2 in this one, coming off of a win. Last time out, gets a P2 on the cards when Lando definitely did not look like he was on the pacer in the hunt really much this weekend. And I think we need to talk about whether a Piastri charge is coming, because it seems like he's finally kind of gotten a hold of his tire wear issues. It seems like he's definitely gotten a lot better at tire management. And so we've seen him kind of put back-to-back very, very good results in. And I'd be very interested to see if a charge is coming from the young Aussie as he continues to develop. Obviously still only in his second season in F1. He looks like he is very near challenging for wins at this point. It'd be very interesting to see what McLaren and what they do with him and Lando as the season continues on. But I'm very happy for Oscar. He ran a very, very good race himself and ultimately finds himself P2 on the podium. Congrats, Oscar. I think the last thing I want to talk about is Charles Leclerc and Ferrari. Charles on the podium must feel pretty good. Surely he got it through the disqualification of George Russell, finishing in P3. But he did end up putting it on pole position. The first time we've seen a Ferrari start the race on pole. I know he didn't take pole position, but he started on pole position, which must have felt pretty good. He even led after the first lap, but then ultimately was overtaken by Lewis and ended up running in the front, but not necessarily obviously in the lead. But at the same time, when he's had a run of form he's had in the last 5-6 races, it must be very, very good feeling to get back on the podium again. So Charles, congratulations. Outside of that, there really wasn't a whole lot of this going on in terms of big talking points. I mean, we saw Fernando Alonso finish in the points in this one. Esteban Ocon gets Alpine back in the points, finishing in P9. And Daniel Ricciardo takes the last points paying position in P10, thanks to George's retirement. So, unfortunately, as a Haas fan, this is a terrible result because both Alpine and RB finish in the points again and extend themselves above us. But at the same time, we're coming for it. I was very disappointed in Haas this weekend. I think we were going to perform a lot better than we ultimately did. I don't think qualifying helped with the tricky conditions, but at the same time, we still only came home to finish P14 and P18. So, a long weekend for us. Hopefully, we'll bounce back in Zandvoort. I'm very looking forward to that, seeing how they do around there. It'll be very interesting. And I think ultimately that's kind of the big talking points in this one. It kind of turns into a very positional race, and ultimately I think that comes with a shorter list of quick hits for the weekend. Let's move along quickly to our weekend winners and losers, and we will begin with our weekend winner. And I think the winner this weekend is going to be Lewis Hamilton, getting win number 105 and podium number 201. Now, obviously, he ended up taking the win thanks to the disqualification of George Russell, which we have talked about at length already in this recap. But at the same time, it will feel good eventually. I'm sure he's pretty happy with the result deep down somewhere. I'm sure he does feel bad for George, but at the same time, I think he feels like he deserved that win after the race he ran. He ran the race basically all race long. He got into the lead very early. He drove away from the Ferrari and Sergio Perez and Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri and created a gap by about 3 seconds, and then basically was in charge of the race the whole way. And it wasn't until George very late considered and executed the one stop that ultimately he crossed the line in P2. I'm thinking at the end of the day he'll still be happy he won the race. So I think with that, Lewis, you're my winner for this weekend. Then on the other side of that coin, we have our weekend loser, and I think we're going to stick in the Mercedes camp because it has to be George Russell, right? I mean, to run a perfect race, a strategy call for the ages, and then to hold off both Lewis Hamilton and Oscar Piastri, who are on much, much, much fresher tires, was a masterclass for you, George, and I'm sorry that ultimately... I don't know if it ultimately falls on the team. I don't know if it ultimately falls down on what, but at the same time, a disqualification cannot feel good, especially after a race run like that. So while you ran a very, very good race, and you should definitely take a lot of good things away from this, at the same time, I have to say you're the weekend loser, not even just because you did anything bad, but just because ultimately to lose a race win like that cannot feel good. So I'm sorry, George, but you are my weekend loser. Before we jump into our predictions results, I hope you're excited about the new office. We officially moved in, and if you saw my predictions video, you'll see that this office looked very different. I obviously got a lot of it cleaned up. Don't worry about this pile over here. That is still a work in progress, but you can also see a little sneak peek of some new equipment coming in that's going to get set up very, very quickly, literally right here. So stay tuned for that. That is more for the sim racing side than the predictions and the F1 side, but I'm very excited about it. I wanted to point it out because that is the first piece in what is going to be a very large collection of boxes that's going to accumulate in this area over the next handful of days. So I'm very excited. I want to point that out. But without further ado, thank you for indulging me for a moment. Let's talk about our predictions results. A very tough day, not only for us, but also the community. We'll run through these quickly because I don't know if there's really much worth talking about. I really just did not hit the mark this weekend. Biggest positive surprise, I went for Haas. I really expected Haas to perform a little bit better this weekend. Ultimately not, and so no point for me there. Biggest disappointment, I went for Aston Martin. For whatever reason, Aston Martin's just been floating around in no man's land, and it really felt like a weekend where they might struggle. But we did see Alonso finish in the points, and Stroll, who looked like he was going to finish down the order, ultimately did finish in 11th, thanks to the George DSQ. So no point for me there either. Off to a rip-roaring start. For our quality top three, I actually did end up pulling a single point total on this one. I had a Lando Norris pole, which did not happen. I had a Max Verstappen P2, so I gave myself a half point for that like we normally do. Now, we will say in our community predictions, we did say that the grid penalties did not matter in terms of our qualifying predictions. Max ended up setting the fastest time in Q3, so we included him in our results. So if someone had predicted a Max Verstappen pole, they would have gotten a point for it. Unfortunately, I predicted him second, so only a half point for me there. And then I had a Charles Leclerc P3, probably my best prediction I made all weekend long, unfortunately. So I get a half point there, as Charles did end up coming home and finishing in second in qualifying, obviously started on pole. So qualifying top three, I come away with 1 total point, and you'll notice something as we continue going. As we move on to my race podium, I had a Max Verstappen win, Lando Norris P2, and a George Russell P3. I will say I did make these predictions before Max Verstappen's 10th place grid penalty was announced, so that's why I ultimately had him winning. Lando Norris did not look like he was on any pace all weekend long, especially on his turn one where he dipped into the gravel and almost lost about 6 or 7 positions. So that one was out the door basically immediately. And then I had a George Russell P3. Ultimately, he ended up coming home to win, but then obviously being disqualified removes him from that. So no points for me there in my race podium. And then my one crazy prediction was a double Haas points finish. I had high hopes today. I had high hopes for this one, and they did not come home to roost. So as you can do the math, as we kept going, I come home to finish with a single point this weekend, bringing my total to 51.5 points on the year. British, not too bad himself, is now on 47 points. Senel, who has tied me atop the standings at 51.5 points. F1 Inferno with 30 points, and Andrew hot on his heels with 29.5 points. We are Michael Masseying this predictions championship to a T, as the top three are very close, and we even have a tie atop the standings going into the summer break. But guys, that only leaves one question remaining. What is next for Formula One? Obviously, the summer break is here, and everyone, including the teams and us as fans, get a nice break to recollect ourselves after a crazy last 6 races. For what we saw on track. So everyone gets to take a nice little break, get a breather in, regroup, drink some water, relax before we head back to Zandvoort here in a month from now. But we'll go ahead, we'll talk about Zandvoort, what we saw last year. Last year we saw a Verstappen, Alonso, Gasly podium. One of the crazier podiums we saw all of last year. Do we see another crazy podium like that, or are we going to return to a more traditional podium? What do you think? Let me know down in the comment section below. But guys, that is going to wrap up here for this weekend. I hope you enjoyed the summer break. I hope you enjoyed the Belgian Grand Prix. Let me know down in the comment section below what you have planned for the summer break. I'm going to try and do a mid-year recap video, kind of talking about what's happened so far. Take a look at my predictions that I made before the season began and see how they're trending. And then we'll be back here in a handful of weeks for the Dutch Grand Prix. In the meantime, if you haven't already, subscribe down below, leave a comment, about whatever you want, whatever you think. And as always, leave a like if you enjoyed the video. That's going to wrap it up for me here, guys. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one.